tonight then, hopefully you all have an outline. Yeah, so the outline is there on the overhead right now. And basically, I'm going to cover the establishment of the Scottish Gaelic community in PEI, and I also want to talk about the Scottish Gaelic community on PEI in its heyday, which is actually what I'm most particularly interested in myself in some of my research. So I'm uncovering the types of evidence that we can find in manuscripts, in archives, as well as in newspapers from in the 19th century, as well as some of the recordings done in more recent times. So we're talking about the Gaelic community in its establishment, in its heyday, and in its decline, and whatever kind of residue or remnants we can have of what have been found in more recent times. So that's what we'll be talking about tonight. So I will get out my trusty laser pointer at various aspects to point out some things buried in my pocket. So we'll start out talking about some of the major Scottish settlements in PEI. Now, some of this, I'm sure many of you will know already, but some of it you might not know. But in getting the Scottish community established on PEI, we may have had as early as 1764 some settlement of PEI of people of Scottish background, because some of these were Fraser Highlanders who had fought in the Plains of Abraham, and after the defeat of Quebec, or defeat of France in North America, a number of these Scottish soldiers were offered property in the Maritimes. Not all of them took up these grants, but some of them did. So as early as 1764, we have some people of Scottish background coming here. But the first group settlements came as early as 1770, as you can see on the overhead there. And that's the Captain Stewart settlement in 1770 on board the Annabella. It's a small settlement of about 80 people, and they came from the Argyll area of Scotland and settled in the Malbec area. Their ship didn't actually land. It floundered on the coast, and they had a bit of trouble. That was in the Lot 13 area, or Lot 15, no, Lot 13, I believe. Lot 18, and then they moved over to Lot 13, the people actually, that were stranded at first. But it was a small settlement at first, so we're not actually sure how many of these people would actually have been Gaelic speakers either. The next settlement was the Montgomery settlement of 1770, a bit further east in the Conehead and Stanhope area, mostly from the Perth area of Scotland. But the two major settlements in Scotland that came from Scotland to the island were, of course, these famous settlements: the Glenaladale settlement of 1771, 1772, and the Selkirk settlement a little bit later on in 1803, which carried on from there for a few years. One of the trends was amongst Scottish communities was that we have chain migration happening. People from a particular area in Scotland would come to the island or anywhere else that they came to in the New World, and this would attract later settlers from that same area in Scotland. So you have some chain migration happening, and so we have whole communities leaving Scotland coming to the island that way. So those two latter settlements are the most famous in island history. But the other two that I wanted to mention, because they're significant, remember, Nova Scotia always gets the kind of reputation of being New Scotland, and the start of the Scottish settlement in the New World with the Hector at Pictou. But actually, it started here in Prince Edward Island in terms of the Scots coming to what is now known as Canada. And then some of these people picked up and then went over to Nova Scotia. Many of the Glenaladale people, of course, were Catholic, and some of these people picked up, went to the mainland in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton. As a matter of fact, the first Scottish settler in Cape Breton was Michael Linkletter, who started the settlement in the Judic area of Cape Breton. He was from the Glenaladale settlement. So there we have a number of the major communities being established in PEI then. From Gaelic, most of them would have been Gaelic speakers. point looking at the establishment once the Gaelic community is here. What were the numbers like? Well, by the mid-1800s, the census that was done in 1855, the population of the island was estimated was at about 76,000 people, and half of those were Scots, and it's estimated that a third of the population, at least, were Gaelic speakers, Scottish Gaelic speakers. So to this day, it's still reckoned as the largest ethnic group on PEI, but you can see on the map there that I put on the overhead, I colored it in for you. This is from a famous book called 3 Centuries on the Island by Clark. And he shaded in those areas. It was black and white originally, but it didn't come out very well in overhead without coloring it in. But so I colored it in there, but he divided the areas up on the island according to the major influences of the regional dominance. So the green on this map would be the Irish, the blue, the Scots, and the red, the English, the white area, the Acadians, and Charlottetown. It's not completely accurate, of course, but it gives you an idea of the areas that those three major groups from the British Isles were dominant in on the island. So you get an idea there. Now, the next slide, you get more of an idea in terms of place names. Out of 119 place names that have British origin in Prince Edward Island, 74 of them come from Scotland. And you can see on the map there, these are place names you find in Scotland that are on PEI. And then over here at the bottom of the map, I'm sorry that that's not very clear, but you can see the darker areas in the bottom map of PEI are the place names that come from Scotland. And it makes sense to look at the map that I had on there before, and you can see that the place names largely correspond to the blue areas on the colored map. So we have a significant proportion of the population then from Scotland who are Scottish Gaelic speakers. What is some of the evidence then of the Scottish Gaelic speakers from that community in its heyday? Well, poetry is one of the most important aspects of Scottish Gaelic society, which was passed down. And we have some of this poetry preserved in a newspaper called Macalla, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a few minutes. Macalla was a very famous all-Gaelic newspaper which was published out of Sydney, Cape Breton. And some of this poetry actually originally was published in that newspaper, but we know it came from Prince Edward Island originally. This is an example of one of the poems from Macalla, and we don't know who wrote it. We were just told that it was written by a Maclean poet who lived on the bank. And this is just an excerpt from that poem. And this has been translated by Sister Margaret MacDonnell, who actually has a very famous book called The Immigrant Experience. And she has a section on each area in North America that the Scots came to. And it's all on the poetry of those areas. So this fellow, it goes, Skundat ek fer die uiting, ach lai heur as a yeeg, was keenel fat and early, the hill on good egg. No one can procure anything unless he wrests it from the forest. The length of winter is depressing, it is fully half one's lifetime. So this was actually not an uncommon sentiment by these early settlers. There was a more famous Maclean poet who settled on the mainland in Nova Scotia, actually not far from Antigonish. Originally came to Barney's River between Pictou County and Antigonish County there, but later on picked up and moved down the road a bit further into Antigonish County. And his name was John Maclean, and he was a very, very famous poet who emigrated to Nova Scotia from Scotland in 1819, and he's probably one of the most famous poets to ever have emigrated from Scotland, and certainly the most famous poet to ever come to Canada. And he's very famous for writing a poem called Chayadruach, is what it's called nowadays, but originally he wrote it, he gave it the title Oren do America, which means a song to America. But there's a line in the song referring to a Chayadruach, which means the gloomy forest. And he has very similar sentiments to this fellow. He complains about how severe the summers are in terms of the heat, and how drastic the winters are. In the cold, he has to warm up his iron axe before he chops the wood because it'll split the iron. He complains about these creatures which have big long beaks on their heads that come and land on him and suck the blood out of them. He didn't have a word for mosquito. But he complains of the insects and wild beasts of the forest, that type of thing. And so the forest is so pressing and so oppressive. He's lost all of he's lost all inspiration. But he was inspired enough to write that song anyway. This is, in terms of looking at island Gaelic poetry, this is a more famous poem which has been republished from Sister Margaret's book in a number of island publications concerning Gaelic on the island. And this is, again, Sister Margaret MacDonnell's translation, and this by a fellow named Callum McMahon, who came over on, as part of the Selkirk settlement. And this is probably the most famous passage which seems to be quoted. Shisho Ellen and I up to finishing in vast. Slovachin is vein bla poram. Being kochkan fast, I guess kunach for I guess turn is pal is poned. I guess shufkas min krövan the ein du ser. Speaking the Ruben Mora, Slimatacha Jadak Boer, and Skach Boven is Boo. Shark Hopausch is the born Gaola. This is the Isle of Contentment where we are now. Our seed is fruitful here, oats grow and wheat in full bloom, turnip, cabbage, and peas. Sugar from the trees may be had here free. We have it in large chunks. There is fresh red rum in every dwelling and shop, abundant as the stream being imbibed here. A little bit opposite from the previous poem. So this fellow had a good impression of the place. But sometimes these songs would make their way back to the old country, and they would either encourage or discourage people who learned these songs and heard these songs in the old country. And that happened to the Bard MacLean. John MacLean, who I mentioned, wrote the Gloomy Forest song. When his song went back to Scotland, his friends and family back there were dismayed to hear of his difficulties in the New World, and they offered to bring him back over and pay his passage back to Scotland. And his patron, who supported him in the poetry, actually even offered to supply him with a house, which is actually quite interesting because that was one of the things that in traditional Gaelic society that a patron often did for his poet. He would give him a dwelling to live in. And this Bard MacLean in Nova Scotia was the last of these traditional bards in Gaelic society in Scotland. And he was known in Scotland as Bard Iarna Cholla, which means the poet to the laird of Call, the island of Call. And he's the last poet in Scotland to have such a designation, which was a traditional designation for a poet. And so we get to talking about Matala then. Matala just means echo. Actually, in explaining the definition of that term Matala, echo, I want to point out on the very first page that I put on there, and it's on your handout. I have Ellen Flusa, This means the island of the prince. And that was what the Gaels of the island referred to PEI as. They didn't bother putting Edward in there. They just ended so the island of the prince, and that was all that was needed. Everybody knew what they were talking about. And the rest of the title of this talk is the Prince Edward Island Gaeltacht, from settlement to decline. Gaeltacht is just it has a couple of meanings. It can be just a Gaelic-speaking community, or in Scotland, it actually refers to the Highlands. The Irish have a similar word, Gaeltacht, which refers to the Gaelic-speaking areas in Ireland. So, the Prince Edward Island Gaeltacht, or the Gaelic community of Prince Edward Island, then. In Macalla, the editor of Macalla was a Jonathan McKinnon. His great-grandfather emigrated to PEI originally, and then went over to Cape Breton. And 3 of the brothers actually stayed on PEI. McKinnon made a visit to PEI at one point, and he published his tour in Macalla, the newspaper. And this was in 1897. This has actually been republished and translated in the Island magazine a few years ago. And this is the translation from the Island magazine. His passage here that I quoted is actually quite interesting because it reveals a community, a Gaelic-speaking community that is still quite strong, but it's a Gaelic-speaking community that also is in decline. We've got both things going on here. There's lots of Gaelic being spoken, but I'll read it and you'll see that McKinnon remarks on how some of their attitudes are towards Gaelic. There are but few in the parish who don't understand Gaelic, but who are not very fond of it. There are 3 or 4 parishes around Valleyfield where little is preached but Gaelic. I noticed in Prince Edward Island, as one could also notice on Cape Breton, that there are places where the Gaels have forgotten their Gaelic, or if they have not, they are making every effort to hide it. One will meet people and know without any difficulty that Gaelic is their best language, but they will not speak one iota of it to you, unless you force them to do so against their will. The children of these people have not a word of their ancestors, and one can truthfully categorize them with those people of whom the bard said, they lost the Gaelic and anything better they never got. And the English spoken by those who would belittle the Gaelic, I would not have it for anything if it could at all be avoided. I met several people of that type in Prince Edward Island, but they did not surprise me at all. I could say to them, as was said by the man who met the ghost, away with you, fellow, I have seen your like before. But I will spend no more time discussing these people. They were not the subject of my interest in Prince Edward Island, and wherever I may have met them. I certainly met none of them in Valleyfield or Heatherdale. There is nobody in these places, among the youth at any rate, who cannot speak English, and there is only the odd, exceptional individual who cannot speak Gaelic clearly and fluently. So we have a little bit of a picture presented there. There's some strong areas of Valleyfield and Heatherdale area that seem to be strong in McKinnon's time, but it seems to McKinnon that the younger people are being taught the language, and there's a certain stigma attached to the language. People don't want to admit that they can speak it. So a bit more on that in a minute. Now, what else can we get from Macalla then, in terms of giving a bit more of a picture of the Gaelic-speaking community in PEI in its heyday? We have an interesting thing that McKinnon did, and that was that he tended to publish the names of people who are paid up in their subscriptions. And the reason he did this was a way of shaming the people who haven't paid their subscriptions, because, you know, if your name wasn't there and you're getting the newspaper, then obviously, you know, you haven't paid. But the thing is, with this newspaper, he had an awful time trying to get people to pay their subscriptions because, or even to get people to subscribe, because even though it was a very, very popular newspaper all over the Gaelic-speaking world. It had subscriptions all over Canada and the United States, and of course in Scotland, but also in New Zealand and Australia and South Africa. He had a hard time getting people to pay and to get subscriptions because sometimes the newspaper would go to one person in the community might have a subscription to the newspaper, but everybody would go over to his house or her house, and he would read out the paper to everybody. It was actually very in keeping with Gaelic tradition to do that, to read out and to have an audience and do it orally. But it was not conducive to Gaelic publishing because nobody was buying the books or the newspapers, or not enough anyway. At any rate, what's significant about Mactala is that it's probably the longest Gaelic newspaper of its kind to ever have existed, which is quite something, and that it comes from the New World to be able to say that. From 1892 to 1904, he just couldn't keep it going after that. At that point, it was just too much. He complained that he wasn't getting enough subscriptions, yes, but he would often use material. A lot of it was original material that he got from people submitting things from his subscribers, so from PEI, from Nova Scotia. But he also reprinted a lot of material from other Gaelic newspapers. But that was a common practice at the time, to reprint from other sources. Jonathan McKinnon was an interesting fellow. He also translated a number of books from English into Gaelic as well, including Treasure Island and some other books. So we have a list there, as you can see on the right-hand side, a number of subscribers that actually are from PEI. So we have right from about the sixth line down here, Anturimach C. Campbell, Strathalapa, PEI. And this fellow, Anturimach, just means Reverend. Reverend C. Campbell from Strathalpan, PEI. And this is an interesting fellow because he contributed a ton of material to Mactala from PEI. So he's another interesting person, and what I'd like to do is some sort of future project, go through with the Mactalas and collect all the material that I can find that is related to PEI and put that together somehow, perhaps as a book. So we have from this fellow down to about here, all from PEI. So that's just in one issue that he's publishing with people who paid up for subscriptions. We also have a number of ads placed in the newspaper from PEI. This is one of them. What's interesting about the ads in Mactala was that they were all in Gaelic. He didn't bother nowadays, if we have a Gaelic newspaper at all, the ads will be in English, most of them. But this fellow translated everything and put it all into Gaelic, which makes some of it's quite entertaining. But this is an example of one of the ads that showed up quite frequently. And this is D.A. McGillivray, which is McKinnon, Fetaki, Corlicha, noted, I guess, Russian Irish, which is just etc. D.A. McKinnon, barrister, solicitor, notary, etc. Dalahioish, which is Georgetown. EPI, which makes it clear, because the initials are still there, we know that that's PEI, but Aylin, Afiunsa, remember E, P, and then the I is for the Gaelic equivalent of Edward, which is Ivor, Ivor, the name Ivor. It's a form of Edward. Now there is in Gaelic today, people might say Edger for Edward. For instance, I've been to Scotland and they ask you where you're from, and I would say Aylin, Afiunsa, E, Edger. But they might understand what you're talking about because most of them have heard of Prince Edward Island, of course. A lot of them think it's actually part of Nova Scotia. And sometimes they think that Cape Breton's its own little province. But I always straighten them out. At any rate, then, another very interesting ad showed up in Mactala on a number of occasions. It's actually my favorite. And we have this ad placed in the newspaper by John McLeod and Company of Charlottetown. And I have done a little bit of research in the archives here to check out who this John McLeod was. And he was a tailor on Queen Street in the 19th century in Charlottetown. And this is the ad that was placed in Mactala. Smash die goed zo ledig, maar gaat toe een gormel verder. Staat nog een miri 18 pen in Joe Sketta. Ik is geen nieuws als ik heker shin aan een attachments kun je 18 zo goed het af frekkester je man. Ik is nou van hoe heen die machine maar tolak het toch man die naar jesje zijn jesje en de sargi en de skorgut al glijn maar cloud en is koud nog toch more te leutach achter. Han ik geld erin achter gewoon acass004. Had de diener glowing ek 207 Queen Street, Charlottetown, BPI. Keinig, this is the great line in this is the very last line. Keinig nach jeju shakadora or rechtje fruit and Gaelic. The very last line, remember not to go past them because they'll serve you in Gaelic. So you get service in Gaelic, and I thought that was great when I came across that. But the ad in English, if you can make it out there on the overhead, it is well worth your while to read this if you will take the advice that will be given to you. It is a pleasant thing to see a well-dressed woman, and the thing which comes closest to that in pleasure is to see a man with his clothes well coordinated. And if you want to be like that yourself, if you like a suit with good material and a suit that is excellently made, you should go to John McLeod and Company. They have a large stock of clothing and have cutters as good as can be found. They do business at 207 Queen Street, Charlottetown, PEI. Remember not to go past them because they'll serve you in Gaelic. Now, probably one of the biggest indications of the Scottish Gaelic community in its heyday is from this fellow named Alexander MacLean Sinclair. He was a native of Nova Scotia. He was born near Antigonish, and he was actually the grandson of the bard John MacLean that I mentioned already, who composed that poem, The Gloomy Forest. And this fellow has been the subject of my research for the past few years, and the subject of my PhD thesis. So I'll try not to go on at too much length about this fellow because I could probably keep you here for a couple of hours, but I'll avoid doing that. But this fellow is very interesting in terms of PEI because he was a minister here in Belfast from 1888 to 1906. For about 18 years. He actually retired in 1906 and went back to the mainland. And he retired in Hopewell, which is a small community in Pictou County. And when he was living in Hopewell, he commuted on the train to Antigonish in the Falls, and he lectured at St. Yves in Celtic studies. He lectured about Gaelic literature and Highland history and Celtic civilization. And in the spring terms, he would take the train to Halifax and lecture at Dalhousie University. And this was in his retirement. But throughout his life, he was largely interested in Gaelic poetry especially, but also genealogy and Highland history. He was raised in his grandfather's household with Gaelic as his mother tongue. But he published a number of books in Gaelic, especially Gaelic poetry. And 20 books actually, and 13 of those were actually published here in PEI. Or he had actually published while he was living in PEI. I shouldn't say that 13 of them were actually published in PEI, but a number of them are actually published here in Charlottetown by Hazard and Moore. But he had a consistent complaint in his publications, in his books. He contributed many articles to newspapers in Scotland, in Canada, and in the United States on a lot of different subjects, but especially Highland history and genealogy and Gaelic poetry. But whenever he did write on, he always wrote authoritatively. He wrote a small book on the peoples and languages of the world, which he sent to a colleague in Scotland who advised him not to quit his Gaelic publishing. But it is very entertaining reading to hear his views on these various subjects. But at any rate, in terms of Gaelic publishing, it's significant then if you look at this list of Gaelic publishing that was compiled by Derek Thompson, a very renowned Gaelic scholar in Scotland. He said that by the second half of the 19th century, in the New World, this is how Gaelic publishing measures up. In Charlottetown, we have 9 books published. In Antigonish, 8. Sydney and Pictou, 5 each. Toronto, 4. Halifax, 3. Bedeck, Fayetteville in North Carolina. Kingston, Ottawa, 1 each in those areas. So you can see Charlottetown is at the top of the list there in terms of the Gaelic publishing. What's also interesting about McLean Sinclair is that he collected. He went out in the community. He was a minister, and he would teach. He would minister in Gaelic. He would give his services in Gaelic, but he would also collect poetry and songs and genealogical information and oral history from his informants amongst his congregation, and he would travel to various places in Nova Scotia while he was a minister there before he came over to the island. And so there's a number of poems in his books that actually come from islanders as well. Now, in looking at decline, actually, before I get to decline, I wanted to show you some more slides from relating to McLean Sinclair. Has anybody been to the Glenbard Cemetery in Antigonish, just outside Antigonish, near James River? There's a little cemetery there in a community called Glenbard, just near James River, just before you get to Antigonish, and that's where the Bard McLean spent his last years. And that's where Alexander McLean Sinclair was born and raised. There's a little cemetery there with a number of significant tombstones, and one of them is the Bard McLean's tombstone itself. It's all in Gaelic, and it says Ambart Mascayen, which just means the McLean poet. At the top, it has the year 1787 to 1848. At the bottom, in the bigger letters, it says Ben the Bard, which just means the wife of the Bard. So we don't actually have either one of their names, but enough on the tombstone, but we know it's the Bard McLean who he is. He's very famous. His wife's name is Isabella Black. And her dates are there. In her little passage at the bottom, it says, Eda Esanchina Idolachia, which means trust in the Lord with all your heart. So a biblical sentiment. And then the passage under the Bard McLean is a passage, I'm pretty sure that this tombstone was erected by his grandson, Alexander McLean Sinclair. And so I think that this passage was made up by McLean Sinclair. And it says, Eerst de glok ze had boven goors, staat de zeest die goe van de oorschel, koe dadelijk zoals je deel, ze kunt baartig saartje gloor, toch echt niet aan na, of graag, spichin deel, te hier graag waar. Which means, hey, you in the cemetery, you know, he's talking to you. It's what I love about this tombstone is speaking right to you. You know, it's literally an old man in the cemetery who's walking around. Stop and listen to a voice from this grave. He's grabbing you. Keep up the Gaelic for your life. And its share of poetry of the highest glory. To every good thing, give love. and come alive to God every day. McLean Sinclair, as I mentioned, was a minister, so he included, of course, it's very appropriate to have that kind of a sentiment on a tombstone, but the sentiment as well to the poetry of his grandfather, and to keep the language alive. That's the cluster of the gravestones in Glenbard in Nova Scotia. Alexander McLean Sinclair is right there in the very center, but the bard, his grandfather's tombstone to our left on the slide there, and his mother's to the right. The bard McLean was his maternal grandfather. Christy McLean was his mother. She married a fellow named John Sinclair, whom I don't believe spoke Gaelic, and I think that was maybe one of the reasons that led to their eventual separation. She actually was only with John Sinclair for maybe a month or two, because 9 months later, Alexander McLean Sinclair was born, but she had actually moved back to Glenbard in her father's house to give birth to him. And they never divorced. Of course, divorce didn't exist in rural communities at the time. It did exist in Halifax, but it didn't exist in this area. So something occurred there. She was a little bit older when she got married. She was in her early 30s, so at the time, nowadays it's nothing, of course, but at the time, that was getting up there to be married in the pioneer community, and I think it was a bit of an arranged marriage. It wasn't a happy one anyway. But it was a good thing for Alexander McLean Sinclair because it meant that he was raised in a household that was steeped in Gaelic tradition. Although his grandfather died when he was eight years old, he had his grandmother and his mother, who were very well, and his uncle and his aunt, all living in the same household, who all were native Gaelic speakers. And his grandfather brought two very important manuscripts over to Nova Scotia from Scotland. And these manuscripts, they have poetry in there stretching back 200 or 300 years previously, and there's poetry in those manuscripts which aren't found anywhere else in Scotland. So they're very important manuscripts today in the archives in Halifax, and they formed the basis of McLean Sinclair's publications, many of them. This is just McLean Sinclair at various ages. But I want to show you this one. This is from a chapter in my thesis, but the little passage that I have there, it's an excerpt of a poem that I found going through the McLean Sinclair papers in the public archives of Nova Scotia in Halifax. And this is an excerpt from a poem that was written by a Prince Edward Islander, I'm pretty sure. It doesn't exactly say from PEI on it, but the way that the letter was addressed, it seems to me that he's from PEI. And he was a fan of McLean Sinclair's. And he says, "Bedoel goed te hebben bewaard die misselijke jaren, hecht zich het vaderschap, then it became voor de naam. It was your birthright from your mother's side to be respectful of Gaelic, its history and its poetry, and you fervently followed the influence of your nature." And what's interesting about this poem is that McLean Sinclair had a bit of a reputation for actually changing his poems from the original versions in the manuscript, tidying them up when he published them to make sure that they're perfect in form. And make sure that they rhymed properly according to the rules of poetry, but also that they didn't contain anything that might offend anyone. Remember, he was a minister, this was the Victorian era, he didn't want to offend anyone. So What's interesting that when I found this in the archives in Halifax is that this was never published, by the way, this poem. Michael Linkletter had a piece of paper attached with it, and he was playing with it, and he was changing it, and changed it around, and he had a penchant for trying to make things perfect and better. And this particular phrase, the dual root, is a Gaelic proverb, which just means that was your birthright, and it suits Michael Linkletter very well, because he felt this imperative from his parents' side, especially from his mother's side, to go on and work in Gaelic. And that was the line he changed from the original. The original said, dual root the hurt of father, which means you get your birthright from your parents. But he specifically changed it and said, your mother, from your mother's side. So in talking about decline then, a number of factors contributed to the decline, although it's impossible to ever say exactly why Gaelic declined or at what point it started to decline. But these are some of the things that I've kind of put out there, hypothesized about what contributed to the decline in Gaelic and PEI. Of course, assimilation. Assimilation into the English dominant society of PEI. Remember that the government, the infrastructure, the education, business were all British-based, and therefore English was the language of all of these things. English was the language of government. English was the language of education, of banking, of business and the economy. There was the pressure to assimilate so that these new immigrants, or not even new immigrants, but these Gaelic speakers would fit better in society by learning the language of the dominant group. And I would say that this assimilation process was promoted by the geography of the island. Look at the map there, of course. We all know that the island is somewhat crescent-shaped, but long and narrow. One community is not very far from another. We have gentle rolling hills. In the wintertime when the bay freezes over, it's easier just to cross the bay, go over your neighboring community rather than go all the way around the shore. We have communities that are fairly close. You look at the places in Scotland, very rugged country. Look at Cape Breton, it's some very rugged terrain there. It's harder to get from one isolated community to another. So I would say that geography is a certain factor. The nearness of communities, the nearness between a Scottish Gaelic-speaking community, say, and maybe a community of another language, say, French or English. Out-migration was certainly a significant factor. The so-called maritime diaspora, in which many people left from the Maritimes to go down to the so-called Boston States. Between 1881 and 1901, we have a 15% decline in the Scots on PEI. And for some reason, out-migration was particularly predominant amongst the Scots and the Irish in the Maritimes. This continued into the 1900s, but we have some of these actual Scottish Gaelic communities being transferred to the Boston area. Quincy, there was a Gaelic book published in Quincy, Massachusetts, which was a book of Gaelic poetry from Cape Breton and PEI. And the person who published that was the son of Ewan Lamont. Does that ring? Anybody know Ewan Lamont of the Free Church, the MacDonaldites? He was an elder in that church. And so his son published a book down in Quincy. And the Free Church of Scotland, the MacDonaldite, they actually a number of them went down into Boston and set up a couple of churches and supplied ministers to churches down in that area, Gaelic-speaking ministers. There were some Gaelic-speaking congregations of the Free Church of Scotland, the MacDonaldite sect, down in the Boston area. As a matter of fact, when I was going to Harvard, right around the corner from me, I was reading the little history that I found in the bookstore in Summerside on the MacDonaldite sect, And I saw on the back that there was a list of some of these churches in Boston. And so I looked up the address, and sure enough, it was right around the corner from me, one of these churches, which was now an African-American church. But a colleague of mine who had visited Boston often, he had driven by there a number of years ago, and the sign was still on it that said, Free Church of Scotland in Cambridge. And that church was supplied by ministers, Gaelic-speaking ministers from PEI, for a little while anyway. Another factor is discrimination, of course, which goes along with certain aspects of assimilation. People want to assimilate because they're being discriminated against. Gaelic was associated with illiteracy and poverty, and so there was a stigma attached to the language. We already saw how Jonathan McKinnon picked up on this when he visited PEI, and other people who have come in more recent years and collected amongst the last of the native Gaelic speakers of PEI, or semi-native speakers. They've all remarked on how strong the stigma against Gaelic was in PEI. We have that in other minority languages. We certainly have it in other Celtic languages, such as Welsh. But it seems to be quite distinct, quite strong in PEI. The largest group of Gaels to settle in PEI were from Skye, the Isle of Skye, and someone from Skye in Gaelic is a Skiahana. And if you've read the book, The Master's Wife, by Sir Andrew MacPhail, he tells us in that book that word Skiahana was often said with a bit of pejorative connotation. So it was a bit of a bad word to call somebody a Skiahana because of this stigma that was attached to the language. It was we often have people describing it as a secret language, a language that their parents or grandparents would use to speak behind their back when they wanted to talk about the kids or say something that they want the kids to hear about. You hear that in a lot of different minority languages, but it was definitely part of the Gaelic culture. The Matikrochi, this was something that was used in schools to discourage the speaking of Gaelic amongst the children. This was a little shingle, a little sign that was hung around the neck. And what happened was that if you were caught speaking Gaelic in class, you were given this shingle to put around your neck as a form of shame. And what you had to do is the only way you got rid of that shingle around your neck was to catch one of your classmates speaking Gaelic. So you could pass it on. We have, in terms of some of the remnants, we have people coming to collect Gaelic. We have Alexander MacLean Sinclair was the earliest person to collect really Gaelic material on the island, but in terms of cassette recordings and video recordings, we have Gordon McLennan, who was a professor at the University of Ottawa, coming in the 1970s. John Shaw, perhaps, did the most important collection. The UPEI, the Institute of Island Studies, hired John Shaw to come over to the island and do some collecting amongst the last of the native speakers here. John Shaw was engaged for 5 years collecting material in Cape Breton. In St. FX, St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, was able to get, I think, in total, about $150,000 from the federal government over 5 years to sponsor this Gaelic folklore project. And now it's collected some amazing stuff, and it forms a very important part of the collection of Gaelic material that we have of Nova Scotia Gaelic speakers. So UPEI kind of piggybacked on that and got John Shaw over to do some of that. And Michael Kennedy recently went through all that material again and edited it, and you can find it at the Institute of Island Studies website if you're interested in more information on that. Kenneth Nielsen, who's a professor in the Celtic Studies Department at St. X, also came over and did a little bit of collecting from some of the last native speakers in the 1980s. And he collected, I don't have it on tape unfortunately, but he collected this tradition of Aicha Macallan. This is the New Year's Eve. It was a tradition for people to go from door to door and knock on the door and request to come in and and get perhaps a drink or a little bite to eat, a little treat. This is collected in recent times in English as well. It's a bit of a tradition that went over into English. But this is an example of one in Gaelic, a mixture of Gaelic and English here. This was Daniel Person of Caledonia. He said, they go in with the cash and talon, a pig's head, sheep's head with woolen and kerosene, and there'd be an awful stink, and they'd come in and say to the old lady, hey ho adio, hanagan of kachalin, cashin kalin namavolka, smankel vanershin. Hey ho adio, the callan came tonight, callan cheese in my sack, good as the smoke. That would come from that one. And she'd go on to get the cakes right away and get them out of the house. If she didn't go and get the cakes, they'd light the sheep's head and go around the room with it. And this was something that was done in Scotland. Sometimes it would be a sheep's skin. Another example of this tradition was told by Alan Cameron of Caledonia. And he says, I will win food and clothing, Caledonia, cushing me being is earthy, Caledonia, cushing me ben, that is still fatak in Caledonia. Which is, I will win food and clothing, Caledonia, I will win a wife, if I have a long life, Caledonia, and so on. They said that they would say that at New Year's, and they would sing, and they would have a dance in places, and they would have a little drink as well. And then I thought I would play a brief song that I collected from Reverend Donald Nicholson, who was born in Hartsville, and I collected this in 1995. He's since passed away, but in 1995 he was about 90, I think. And he was collected. He was interviewed by John Shaw and a couple of other people as well. But this is a song called Honey Cheen. He says, Honey Cheen, 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 Honey Cheen, Foshat, and Foshat, Foshat. And he says, I'm sick, sick, sick. I've been sick for a week. And it has to do with an event that involved the church. And it was an event that a minister, I think, was kicked out. And some of the people were upset over this. And there was a poem composed on the occasion. He says the line, after Chunit Mean Kyo, Kyo Aldiaki. It's a place where there was smoke, meaning coming out of the chimney, but now there's no smoke to be seen because it's gone. And he told me that there was a fellow named Murdoch Mackenzie who was the guy that composed it. He was the local composer. People will go to Murdoch Mackenzie if they needed a poem written for a certain occasion. And whether that meant that maybe they needed a satire composed against someone that they didn't like, or that was a very important part of Gaelic tradition, satires. And so this is an example. He had great, his pronunciation there was really good, spoken Gaelic, but it was virtually all memorized. He knew what he was saying, but he couldn't really converse in the language anymore. He just didn't have the practice. All the people that he grew up with that could speak Gaelic, he said his older brother, could speak it perfectly fluently. But once his brother went down, he was one of these people that went down to Quincy, Massachusetts. But he said, he himself, in trying to converse with him in Gaelic, he didn't quite always understand what you were saying. You could see that he was struggling and trying to respond, but he couldn't. And not just me, but other people that I've interviewed have remarked on that. So that's not uncommon when the language is in a stage of terminal decline, to have semi-speakers like that. Now, what are some of the Gaelic influences in English that we have on the island now? So since essentially the Gaelic community has disappeared in PEI, what kind of influences have they left in the English language or the English-speaking culture of the island? The Dictionary of PEI English, written by T.K. Pratt, gives some examples of spa, skrupak, suka, which actually, I don't think I've ever heard anybody in PEI say in English, but maybe some of you have heard people say these words in English. Familiar with anybody here? Maybe from the eastern end of the island? No? Well, a spa is a spot, they probably say spot in English, in an English pronunciation, but it's just a big foot. Somebody who's club-footed. They would use that term. A strupak is a drop of tea. A tea rake, strupak. Sukan is a kind of rope made out of twisting hay or straw together. You twist it together and make a kind of homemade rope. But see, even that's not it's in the Dictionary of PEI English, but it's not common anymore, even in English. But there's other writers have remarked that part of the island accent comes from the Gaelic language, and one writer said there's an unmistakable drawling of the vowels in the Gaelic turn of phrase in the mellows of farmers you run across in the country, which may have romanticized it a bit there, but in essence, some of the lilt that we do have in the maritime accent undoubtedly comes from Gaelic tradition, from Gaelic, an influence of the Gaelic language. We also have an influence of Gaelic in folklore. And what I like about this particular type of aspect is that I like the way Gaelic tradition is adapted into folk life in PEI, in particularly PEI ways. And so there's nothing more unique to PEI than mud digging, muscle mud digging, which we don't have anymore, but during the 19th century, there was muscle mud digging, and I've never heard of this happening anywhere else. Perhaps they do have some kind of thing, but this was a PEI invention. And there were types of community events that were held amongst the Scottish Gaelic communities. Some of you have heard of milling frolics, perhaps, which still go on in Cape Breton, in which the cloth was milled. In Scotland, they're called walking songs. So there were milling frolics, yes, in which Gaelic songs were sung, but there were also mud digging frolics. There were frolics for every occasion, but there was also mud digging frolics, and Sir Andrew MacPhail talks about that in his book, The Master's Wife, how muscle mud digging was, he would have a frolic for this event. There was an interesting little story that I collected that had to do with supernatural and muscle mud digging. And this little story has a number of folk motifs which you can find in other cultures, but I think that this actually came from the Scottish influence in PEI, just because of Thelma Matthews' mother background. This is a story that she told me about her mother, and her mother comes from Scottish background. She had Cruthers and Hendersons in her background, and the area that they lived in was a certain amount of Scottish influence in that area. So I'll play you the tape.
At my grandfather's farm, there was a mud digging hole where they got muscle mud, and my mother was standing at the window this night, and there was a light came down from the mud digger. It followed the shore and came up through the fields, went up the road, and down to the Presbyterian church. And the light fell at the Presbyterian church in Freeland. And the next day, there was a man killed on the mud digger. His corpse was taken along the shore, up through the fields, and he was buried in the Freeland Cemetery.
In your mother's
Scottish?
And my mother was Scottish until the upstairs window.
So, a fun little story. As the language died out in a lot of the folklore and folktales along with it, one of the other people collecting folklore have remarked that it seems that stories of the supernatural often survived better than other kinds of folktales in the transition from Gaelic to English. So this is an example of that, I believe. I just give you some of the motifs. There's this Steve Thompson was a folklorist who came up with a number of these motifs and came up with an encyclopedia of it. So this particular motif fits the classification E530.1.7, which is the ghost light indicates the route that a funeral will take. And there are a number of different types of terminology for supernatural events in Gaelic. They had very specific words for supernatural events. There was the manag, or the dread, the manag. These are explained in this next passage, which is from the book Witchcraft and Second Sight in the Scottish Highlands by J.G. Campbell, who wrote in the later part of the 1800s. And he says, the dread was a light seen in the sky leaving a tail or dress off behind it. And according to some, stopping above the house where the death was to occur, according to others, proceeding from above the house to the churchyard along the line the funeral was to take, which is exactly the story that Ellen Matthews gave me. Manag, the other word there, just means omen. So, in conclusion then, the Gaelic community was established, began in the 1770s, but by the mid-1800s, it's a flourishing community, and a number of it, the evidence of this in publications such as newspapers, books, but it's still strong by the 1900s, but showing that it's in decline. While, and forgive the mixed metaphor here, while demographics, geography, and discrimination stirred the pot of assimilation, out-migration, bled away the lifeblood of the language, some of the reasons that I believe there that contributed to the decline in the language, so I know some mixed metaphors like that's not very good English. By 1990s, only very few Gaelic speakers were left. Some of the last of the native Gaelic speakers were semi-native speakers were Donald Nicholson, Percy McPherson. Donald Nicholson died, actually, forget the year he died, but Percy McPherson just died a couple of years ago, a man who lived down east. And I was told that he was actually quite fluent in Gaelic, and I never had the opportunity to meet him. Does anybody know Percy McPherson? Did you know Percy? He just died a couple of years ago, wasn't he? Yeah. I was very disappointed never to have met Mr. McPherson. And we have remnants of the Gaelic culture, of course, in the English language that's spoken in the island today to a certain extent, as well as in folklore. Something I didn't mention in this was music. The important factor of music here, and the fiddle tradition. And the fiddling tradition probably would have been the most authentic of the, I hate to use that word, but the most authentic of the modern musical traditions on the island that's related to Scotland that comes from Gaelic tradition. Thank you very much. If you have any questions?
It's not a question, but comment calls you're aware. Reverend Donald Nicholson Hong was just demolished this fall.
No, I didn't. No.
Are you familiar where it was?
In Clydesdale? No, that was his original home, you mean?
The one on the long turn, just above the cemetery.
No, I don't know that.
The little home. You heard about?
Oh, no.
That's one of them. And that was interesting to mention him. When I was a child, young, Donald's sister was our next door neighbor. Is that right? His two sisters, one daughter, one service was Anne. And he was married to American friends. They ran the old much time. And my other sister was Christy. I remember her, and I'm sure down there was down from the Ross Road. That's pretty hard to go there. Road was a deep cut, and her phone was used in midway, so they were friends. Whenever we pick up the phone, if they were on the phone, automatically I would stick. Right?
Secret language.
And those two people were the last that I know who also I named John, that I named John, who takes note of the last two that I knew the exact area that spoke.
My grandmother used to not be there. Connie Schnavanich. You ever hear that?
What was the first word?
Connie Schnavanich.
Something of the wedding. Not sure what the first word is. Wedding? Well, Spanish is the wedding.
Really?
Not sure. No. No, it would be or something like the half or the deal or ish or something like that. You know, listen. Did you make up for this thing?
Well, I think Penny on the beat or one of the things remember. So remember the way.
Or meet Connie would be also the command for meet, but it's really quite makes sense. Sorry, yeah.
There's a place in called Corin Dam. We had in the display of book of Kells at Trinity College. There's a poem called Anger Man. And I see you've got something to name your band.
White, fair hair.
What's that?
White or fair hair. Ponderbond is one of the oldest poems in Gaelic. It's interesting. It was written by a monk who went from Ireland to the continent. The monks were traveling to Europe and established monasteries there. And they would write the poems in the margins of these medieval manuscripts. And he had a little white cat, and he picked up in Wales. Pounder is a Welsh name, and so he wrote this very famous poem, Ponderbond. And it's a lovely little poem I teach my students in medieval Irish literature. And it describes how the cat pounces on his prey the same way that I pounce on my little piece of grammar and his parsing text, his Latin text and stuff, and his scribe writing. So it's really wonderful piece. Yeah. But Colin Bond, that in there that would be fair haired Malcolm.
What's Corin?
Corin, I believe Corin is a stream, kind of brook.
I think it was on the sickle. Corin was a sickle. It was where the Weaver River was called Corin Dam, or the one sickle. Rowan trees also.
Frank, you had a question back? Yes, I'm just wondering, it sounds like the Protestant churches did a better job of sustaining the Gaelic than the Catholic, right? These always people you mention, I'm going to guess, they're all Protestant. Is that right? Are there any
Well,
persecuting or church or
the people in Nova Scotia might argue the opposite.
Right.
It seems, that I've actually heard people say, well, and it seems that the Catholics held on to these traditions a little bit longer than the Presbyterians. Look at Pictou County versus Antigonish County, for instance. Pictou County was very strongly Scottish, but it lost the language a long time before Antigonish County. But it's just because of the predominance of who came here. We had the greatest number of those Gaels that came to PEI were mostly Presbyterians, say from Skye. The Glenalladale Catholics, many of them picked up and went to Nova Scotia. The Bishop McEachern, when the Catholics were landing in Pictou, asked, he urged them to pick up and go east into Antigonish and Cape Breton. That's how Antigonish became largely Catholic and Pictou Protestant.
Cape Breton was also, like you said, it was more remote to Bristol Island.
It was.
Other communities.
And I think that having our own government actually contributed to the decline of the language, I think. Cape Breton, in a way, was lucky to have, not to have.
Don't be taking them here.
Yeah,
It was just there.
contributed to their isolation.
could the George was asking me last week with the irony of Gaelic. My question is, was there any difference between the Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic,
in settlements here.
Being able to speak and not understand.
They may have been able to get by a little bit, but it would have been quite difficult, depending on the dialects too, where they come from in Scotland, where they come from in Ireland. The dialects in the north of Ireland are much closer to, say, what Lewis dialect in Scotland, for instance. And with a bit of practice and a bit of understanding how the other language works, they can get by. But somebody from the south of Ireland, Munster, and somebody from the Western Isles of Scotland would not be able to understand each other at all. Somebody from Munster can hardly understand somebody from Donegal in Ireland. Yeah.
But the grammar doesn't.
Yet there are some certain differences, say, between Munster and Donegal dialects that would be.
Yeah, but the grammar doesn't.
There are some grammatical differences too. But the grammar between Scottish Gaelic and Irish, yes, they're different. They're just separate languages. Yeah, for instance, in Irish Gaelic, there's a present tense. For instance, you would say "I walk." You can conjugate a verb, "I walk." In Scottish Gaelic, you can't do that. You would have to say "I am walking." It's a progressive present tense. So there's no immediate present tense in Scottish Gaelic as if there in Irish Gaelic. Both languages preserve archaic elements that left over from the medieval period, and so some people like to say, "Oh, Scottish Gaelic is more archaic; it has more older things," and some other people might say that about Irish. That's not true. Both languages have certain elements that are archaic.
The language goes way back to medieval times.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about the Celtic languages, and particularly the Gaelic branch, is that it has the oldest vernacular literary tradition in Western Europe. Gaelic was being written down before any other vernacular language in Western Europe. People were writing down in Latin, of course, and in Greek, right? In the Middle Ages, they were writing down things in the manuscript in Latin and in Greek. But the first people to actually write down their own language that they spoke in were the Irish. And that language is called Old Irish or Old Gaelic. And as the centuries progressed, the language diverged into the three modern Gaelic languages: Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, and Manx Gaelic, spoken on the island of Man, the Isle of Man. So it's one of the things. There was a long period, a long tradition, a long literary tradition, a native literary tradition, a native educated class in Ireland and Gaelic Scotland that a lot of people just don't know about, because since the English came in and took over, that native educated class and the whole infrastructure that was there in Gaelic society to perpetuate Gaelic learning disappeared when they were conquered. So they weren't able to uphold that native learning tradition, which is one reason why the languages declined in their home countries. It lasted a little bit longer in Scotland. It died out in the native learning tradition, that the class of people that supported that native learning tradition was in the 1600s, say around 1650 in Ireland, and in Scotland it lasted about almost another 100 years.
All right, just a question. The Irish really disappeared much earlier. A lot of the Irish
On the island here?
there's not even half a Gaelic, I guess. And those who had, it disappeared much earlier than the Scottish Gaelic did.
As a community language on the island? Yes. Yeah, my sense of it is I'm not so familiar with the Irish experience on the island as I am the Scottish Gaelic one, but my sense of it is that the Irish didn't have Irish-speaking communities the way that the Scottish Gaels did. But I may be way more familiar with the Irish on the island than I am. But I don't have the sense that the Irish had communities, strong Irish-speaking communities the way the Scots did.
I think the answer why the Scots language was much more prevalent and survived longer is they did not have 100 years of penal laws. When you're absolutely prohibited in your language for 100 years,
Yeah.
it couldn't stop.
Yeah, they had another 100 years on them, yeah. And
So that's, I think, it points to the mind of the Irish language.
I think think that's probably part of it, but also part of it too, and maybe is depends on the immigrant groups that came in, what areas in Ireland they came from. Was the area in Ireland that was on where the language was on its way out, or in a phase where it was kind of more bilingual phase, or all the way out? And I'm not so sure of where the people came from in various parts of Ireland.
Well, the people who came in large concentrations and formed communities with Lion people, and they were pretty well all anglicized by the time they came. Some of them had some Irish, but the central or eastern northern Canada, a lot of them were English speakers. The others came in possible exception, West Prince, they're more scattered.
Well, there are stories in which the Scots on the island are speaking in their language with some of the Irish speaking in their language, and not necessarily completely getting along in terms of understanding one another, and also not just getting along. There would have been religious differences to a certain extent, but Scots didn't get along with Lowland Scots either. The Lowland Scots particularly were worse towards the Gaels than other national groups. The Lowland Scots couldn't stand the Highland Scots on the island. Well, that's a very general statement, but in terms of the language, there was this stigma attached to the language. They saw it as backward and poor class of people and all that kind of thing.
Well, very quote. When they first arrived, he said, Irish people were only two people in each community that could read and write. Was that anything to do with the extending
in the decline of the language? It may have. I know in terms of, I think the Irish were in any of the Celtic languages, the Irish were worse off in terms of being educated in their own language than any of the groups. It was, yeah, part of the penal laws, yeah. But it was in Scotland too, for many phases of its history. The Welsh seem to be pretty lucky in terms of, comparatively speaking, we're lucky. And today the Welsh have the strongest of all of the Celtic languages, and they have a very strong history of learning and education in their language, stronger than any of the Celtic languages.
In absolute numbers, do you have any idea how many Scots Gaelic speakers there were
At its height? I'm not sure of the exact numbers. There may have been as many as 50,000 in Nova Scotia at one point, but perhaps even more than that. That was, say, by the mid to late 1800s. Anybody else have any idea of heard any numbers about numbers of Scots? Well, in the numbers that I gave you there, about 1855, the census of the island was about 76,000, and about a third of that were Gaelic speakers. So
it's always been a fascinating subject. My mother came from Eastern Ireland, about 47, probably 80% to 25% Highland Scots. No doubt they all spoke together when they first came home. My grandmother, as a child, she had some, but the really fluent generation seemed to be like her mother, the generation before that. My mother remembers her grandmother conversing with her fluently in English. But that doesn't show up in things like the 1881 census, which I think asked the language question. And I looked, I zoomed in on lot 47, and very rarely in 1881 did anyone say that they spoke Gaelic.
that's just it. They didn't say that they spoke Gaelic. I think it's one of the reasons why it made it even, especially on the census, an official document like a census.
Explain that, you can
language longer than BEI? Those are all questions I would like to know the answers to myself.
I think the big part of the answer is
And one can only conjecture on a lot of this. I'm not a social linguist.
I think it's school.
Yeah.
I think it's school, the element of school, when schooling became widespread in national schools, devastating effect on the language, same culture. I really think that's it. And I also have this notion, forgive me for going on, this is the sharing experience, everyone's
You're wrong.
But I really think as a culture, there was a real psychological depression across the culture, whether it's Ireland or Scotland, as a result of history, the wars and the losses and so on. There's a song on an album, I think, by Andy Stewart, a Scottish singer, and the line goes, "There's fire in the rain, fire in the flames, but no fire in the hearts of an iron man." What's that saying? That's talking of depression within and the culture. So
Yeah, and I think other writers have remarked on that, just that people are beaten down. And it's not surprising that the language, if you're forced in school to wear this sticker around your neck to catch your fellow classmates speaking the language, I mean, there's no encouragement there to keep it going. And you're ashamed.
mentioned John Shaw. I was with John Shaw in some of the youth groups here, and there were definitely, in his estimation, a handful of fully women really on the island in 1992, whatever it was.
1987, yeah.
Yeah, that,
There was, I thought there was one, according to his report, there was one fully native speaker.
you may be thinking the same one, because I was with John when we interviewed John Fleming or McLeod.
Mm-hmm.
Fleming or McLeod. He was in a nursing home in Charlotte. The man.
I think that was the one that he reckoned was the last full influence.
Well, that's what he said to me. He said, "There's absolutely no question in my mind. This man thinks first people." We walked, I remember walking this room, there's a fellow out here, I don't want to get diabetes or what, but he was in his bed, he was kind of depressed, so John walked here, and stayed behind him, and John addressed him with and responded. And then they commenced dialogue for half an hour, 45 minutes, and by the time with that, the difference in role in terms of energy, vitality, just speaking the language and being able to communicate with someone who, in his own first language, was an amazing transformation just to stop. And I think that gives you kind of an insight into how important language can be. And that really struck me. I wasn't surprised when John said that. And this will be exciting.
Anyhow, I understand your grandmother, my grandmother, losing the age because they were behind in school here. But I can't see them when they live in communities. Can't see them being embarrassed to speak again.
It would have been a whole, it's still that way in Scotland. It's still, it's a community language. It's spoken amongst the people that speak it. If you saw a stranger, you would always speak to them in English first, rather than Gaelic. It's very much a community-based language. They probably didn't speak it at home, maybe amongst people that they spoke it, but they knew that they couldn't use it in Charlottetown or unless they went to the John McLeod company to get their clothes cut. Well, they knew that in order to get ahead, they wanted to do like every immigrant community that ever comes to the New World. They know in order to get ahead, they want them to do well with children. They want children to do better than they did. So they, all in this kind of 19th century notion of progress. came to be educated, and the Scots were adamant in education and very renowned in education, like Sir Andrew McHale. Of course, it's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I encourage everybody to read it. The Master's Life. He talks about education.
Okay, I think we'll, okay, Rob, last question.
One last question, kind of on the subject here. It's kind of seen about the Gaelic students, the church service seemed to be lasting well into the 1900s, almost one of the last years ago. And the education seems to be kind of the opposite, I haven't seen a difference ever had a new language at school. Anyway, I don't know if you found that, but I wonder if you have any insight into what do they prize, the free church especially, for it, and school, and yet school always had to be in English, and the church was always in Gaelic. I wonder, is there something on the site there?
There's an interesting debate about that. You're familiar with the Presbyterian Witness newspaper published out of Halifax in the late 1800s, and there was a Michael Linkletter, who was the minister in Belfast here in PBI. Just right around in the early 1900s, just before he retired, this is when this debate was occurring in the letters to the editor of the Presbyterian Witness, say about 1906. There was a fellow minister on PBI, who was McPhee, who wrote to McLean Sinclair, and I found this letter in the archives, saying, I hope you don't mind that I gave them your name, but I'm suggesting that you start up a Gaelic program at Pine Hill Presbyterian College so that we can have ministers educated in the language. And he had sent this as a suggestion to the letter to the editor of the Presbyterian Witness. And this sparked a huge debate that went on for the next year, went back and forth. It was kind of nasty amongst some. Most of the ministers are well educated, most of them Gaelic speaking, some of them, and completely arguing contrary to that, is that we don't need it. The people that are ministering in Gaelic right now, how did they do that without any Gaelic education? So they seem to be getting along. We don't need that in school. So it was a really strange debate. I would like to do more research into this debate. But it doesn't seem that the Presbyterian Church, I'd like to compare it with the Catholic Church as well. I'd like to look into that more in terms of the Presbyterian Church. It didn't really seem to give actually a lot of infrastructural support in terms of education in the Gaelic language. In terms of the Catholic Church, there was a fellow sent from Scotland to Cape Breton, and he, right around this time too, around 1905, and he went around to various parishes in Cape Breton, and it really sparked a lot of interest in the language again. People felt proud. You hear reports of this in the Antigonish Casket newspaper. People would see how proud they are about their language. And shortly after that, there's this movement to get a Gaelic chair established at Dalhousie, and then St. X heard about it, and they said, we want that too. And so there was a fundraising effort to get this going, and then they hired Alexander and Sinclair to teach at both places. The Pine Hill Gaelic scheme never did come about, although I did find from the United Church archives there, I think it's at Mount A, in the minutes from the Pine Hill, there was an award. Somebody gave some money as an award to the best students in Gaelic, in terms of people who could have a little contest in Gaelic, and maybe it was Gaelic speech or what have you, but they didn't actually teach it in school, but they did give a little monetary award for a couple of years. But that's the extent of it. I know it's kind of roundabout way, but in terms of the relation to your question, it does seem that there wasn't very much support in the church. If there was anything at all, it was only because of the minister who was willing to do it.
Okay, well, let's take a break. We have some lunch for you. Thank you very much, Michael. My pleasure. My pleasure. Our lecture next week, by the way, just very quickly, is on the Highland pipes, the Irish pipes. Ian McGinnis from Nova Scotia. He's living on the island for 45 years. He plays the group called Balance of Steam. We play all varieties of pipes. We're playing mostly the Irish pipes and Irish pipe from the island. He'll be here next week to talk about it, development of pipes, give us an example, demonstration. So do come along. Thank you very much.
Thank you.